Okay, Rhidian, it's just past 1:30. I'll hand over to you. Our two topics this afternoon, everybody, are creep feeding spring-born suckled calves, and the second half of the call will be focusing on concentrate supplementation of cattle at grass. Our expert for the afternoon for both sessions today is Rhidian Jones from SAC Consulting. I'll hand over to you, Rhidian, and come back to you later on when we've got some questions.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to everybody on the line. Yes, the first talk, like Chris said, is creep feeding of spring-born calves, and I suppose the subject splits neatly into sort of three questions, which is why do you do it, when do you start, and then how do you do it, and then finally I'll cover a couple of points of what happens after weaning. So really, why are we creep feeding? Why are we considering creep feeding suckled calves? I suppose it boils down to the fact that what we're trying to do is to sort of smooth this sort of transition to the new diet at weaning time, and to try and minimise all the stresses and illnesses and disease that can happen at that time. However, the other point is that you are spending money on creep feed. Obviously, it's not cheap. It might be £200, £250 a tonne, and therefore you want to know that your money is being well spent. And the first point, I suppose, is that the cost benefit of feeding creep to young calves is generally good, because at that age, when they are from 2 to 3 months of age up until a year old or more, their feed conversion rate is very good. So they are actually going to convert the feed that you're giving them into muscle, into meat and frame, very cost effectively. So that's the one thing, is that you do actually get quite a decent return on your investment. And typically we can see that you might be able to increase weaning weights by about 25 kilos. There's reduced stresses at weaning time, less of a check at weaning time. You're familiarising the calf to a different feed. You will probably, one of the biggest benefits is probably the sort of reduced disease incidents such as pneumonia after housing, so generally speaking, it's a good cost-effective practice. However, it's not compulsory to creep feed. There might be systems where the overall system might be less intensive, and I suppose then perhaps it's not as crucial to do so. And I suppose some of those circumstances might be where you might have extended suckling periods when the calves are left on the cows for 9, 10, 11 months possibly, which I know some people do, and they're housed with their mothers, and then perhaps the weaning can be done on a gradual basis. And in those sort of circumstances, perhaps creep feeding is not as important, because the weaning stresses are being minimised in a different way. So I suppose the stresses that are occurring on the calf are to do with the fact that it's changing its diet from milk and grass onto another diet when they get weaned and housed, and also, of course, that the fact that they'll be missing their mothers in terms of just general companionship and so on. So we're trying to minimise those sort of effects. So I think Chris and I spoke earlier, and we were going to sort of see if there's any questions at this particular stage, and then we'll carry on with the rest of it in a minute or two.
Yes, Rhidian, just one, you talked earlier on, you sort of introduced it really in terms of the cost effectiveness of creep feeding. Have you got a sort of a simple calculation that people could have in mind that would help them evaluate, sort of conversion rates of creep to growth rate, anything like that?
I suppose that if we take a typical sort of cost of feed of £250 a tonne and a feed conversion rate of say 4 to 1, then that gives us quite a neat calculation really. It sort of works out quite neatly that basically you're spending a pound of creep feed will give you £2.50 possibly of live weight gain. So it's a good return. Obviously, your feed conversion rate might not be quite so good as that, or the value of the kilos might be slightly different, or the value of the concentrate might be different. But I think there would have to be quite poor performance really, or probably well under half a kilo a day of live weight gain, which is probably unlikely for it not to be cost effective. And also, of course, you've got to build in the fact that you've got to take the time to actually do the creep feeding, to top up the feeders, and obviously the cost of buying the creep feeders as well needs to be accounted for over a longer period. But I think generally speaking, that is as a direct cost benefit, then it's probably in the region of £1 of concentrates will give you probably £2 to £2.50's worth of live weight gain. Yeah,
and as you said earlier on in the call there, the key is that the younger animals have a more efficient conversion rate. So feed invested at this early stage can pay dividends later on as the animals sort of that bit heavier, that bit bigger in stature, etc.
Yeah, and again, obviously there's a whole range of systems that we're considering here. But yes, I mean, if you put the weight on when it's young and it's sufficient, then it's not going to, they're always going to carry that weight through to meet the target. I mean, you might have a target of a weight in the spring for a spring sale in mind, or you might have be aiming for bulling heifers at 15 months to calve them at 2 years old, and once you've got that weight on them, it's going to be there for later on. Yeah. So either, they exceed the targets, or you can feed them a bit less and save a bit of money later on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, should we carry on? Well, just to remind everybody, if you want to email a question to Rhidian, if anything pops into your mind, email us at brpconf@ahdb.org.uk, brpconf for Freddie @ahdb.org.uk, or text my mobile on 07973 701 211, and I can relay your question to Rhidian. Rhidian, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so that was I suppose the why are we creep feeding. So really, it's now when do you start? And I suppose again, it's like a lot of things. There's no right and wrong to this thing. I suppose the earlier the better, but it depends on the system that they're going on to. I think the minimum you can probably do is probably 4 weeks or so, or thereabouts. But in an ideal world, you'd be starting to creep feed them about 6 to 10 weeks before weaning time. But if you're going to be putting bulls, for example, onto an intensive finishing diet, then really you can start creep feeding them a lot earlier than that, so that really by the time they're weaned, they're onto their sort of post-weaning diet almost immediately. I appreciate that on some farms in more extensive situations where it might be tricky to get access to sites for feeding and so on, then perhaps you can leave it a shorter time, but you still get a benefit of doing that. I think generally for a typical sort of 6 to 10 week feeding period, then you're probably likely to use about 100 to 150 kilos of feed per calf. So just as an idea of how much you're likely to need. Another benefit of creep feeding, which is sort of an indirect benefit, is how you can use it to manage the cow condition. So in certain years, if the cows are lean or if the grass is scarce, you can introduce creep feeding a bit earlier, and that will help the cow to keep her condition rather than it being drained off by the calf continuing to suckle on the cow. The creep feed itself doesn't necessarily replace milk, because milk bypasses the rumen, but it will mean that the calf is getting another feed source, so it's not going to need so much grass, and that will release the grass for the cows then to maintain their condition. So using it also as a sort of herd management tool is another thing, which is an indirect benefit. When you're introducing creep, obviously the problem that you've got is that if you immediately introduce it in an ad lib hopper, the calves don't really know what it's all about. You need to sort of try and encourage them to eat it to start with, and therefore it might be easier to try and introduce it in troughs in a different field if you can shed the calves through, just to get them used to it. But I appreciate that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. But if you are having to introduce a creep feed in a hopper right from the start, you need to be aware that some calves might eat a lot to start with and really get a taste for it, while others might be far more reticent at coming in through the barriers. into the hopper. So, ideally you want all the calves to be benefiting from eating some creep, not half your calves or fewer than that getting a lot of creep. And occasionally, and again, you have to keep an eye on it, I suppose. Then you might find that calves will hog the feed troughs, if you like, and not let others near it. But hopefully that if you keep an eye on it, that shouldn't be an issue. In terms of the composition of the creep, I think the important thing, I think, is that as with any sort of diet, I suppose, is that it is a good high energy ration. You're looking at 12.5 ME, and that it's nice and palatable. It's kept clean and fresh, so that it's going to be attractive for the calves to eat it. In terms of protein content, you're probably looking at it being around about 16% protein. But don't forget that the calves will be getting a fair amount of protein from other sources such as milk and grass. So making sure the energy content is really the crucial thing, that it allows them to utilize that protein. If you're making up a creep mixture yourself, I mean, obviously one option is to just buy a pellet which is made up already for you. It'll have nice flavors included in it, molasses and so on, to keep it nice and tasty for the calves. That will come at a cost, obviously, and sometimes depends on the farm. It might be more or possible, I should say, to make up your own creep. And if you're doing that, I think that you want to make sure that to start with the feed isn't too starchy. So possibly including feeds such as sugar beet pulp or soya hulls or feeds like that have got a bit more digestible fibre in them, and that can be replaced over time by cutting those back and replacing them with cheaper ingredients like cereals, which are more starchy. But you don't want to introduce too much starch early on. Also, including some soya perhaps in it. It is an expensive product, but it is very high quality. And also, don't forget that these calves are developing the rumens, and until the rumens working really effectively, having some bypass protein there from the soya can help to maintain the growth rates until the rumens are fully developed. I think it almost goes without saying, I suppose, but I'm going to say it anyway. That if you're introducing, if you're feeding creep in a hopper, then once it's there ad lib, it needs to be kept topped up, because if it runs empty, then there's a chance that some calves might gorge on it afterwards. But so keep it topped up. Check it every now and then. If there's any sort of spoilage, remove it. So that there's nothing there to prevent the calves from wanting to eat it. And then once they're safely on it, I suppose the next stage then is the actual weaning process itself. And really, weaning, I suppose, how people do it will vary depending on different farms and so on, and what the system is. But really, it is a way of managing cow condition, but also, you need to make sure that these calves are not coming against too many stresses all happening at the same time, and obviously being taken off their mother and put on a different diet and being given several vaccinations and various other things happening to them is all very stressful happening at the same time. So really, hopefully, if you've creep fed them for a month and a half or so, then they should be a wee bit heavier. They should be a bit more acclimatized to a different diet, and they should be able to withstand the stresses a bit more. Just the fact that they're actually, or they should be heavier, will actually help them in that respect, because heavier calves will have more resistance to various things that might happen to them. And I suppose once they're weaned, it's a good idea to keep them on at least some of the creep ration for a few weeks, gradually changing over onto a different diet, just again to minimise any sort of checks that they might suffer at weaning time. And finally, some people will be selling suckled calves at weaning time or shortly afterwards. And again, if you've been creep feeding the calves, it is a good thing, because if whoever's buying these calves will get the benefit as well, I suppose, in terms of rumens are better developed and acclimatized to hard feeding. And it might be an idea just to tell the buyers, well, they've been on this particular blend, or I've been feeding them a mixture comprising of barley, beet pulp, and soya, or whatever it is, just so that they know that that's what they've been getting for the last wee while, so that they can perhaps introduce them to a similar feed when they get them home, and that will help the performance keep going once they've left your farm. Okay, I think that's about it. If there's any questions, that'd be great.
Yep, we do have a few. Can you hear me, Rhidian? You okay?
Yeah, fine, yeah.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of questions. We did have one that I think you've answered. It was about the protein level. So just to confirm, you told us that a ration of about 12.5 ME for energy and 16% for protein was the kind of target area. But the protein is probably the energy. I think you were trying to emphasise more than the protein.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there was a trial written up by Simon Marsh recently that I saw that they were looking at different protein levels for, I think it was autumn-born calves actually, but they showed a benefit of about £10 a head for having a 16% protein mix as opposed to a 13% protein mix. And so, the protein is important as well, but obviously for spring-born calves, I suppose, their other diet is grass and milk, which are both high protein feeds. Therefore, but it's important that there's enough energy there to get everything working. And I mean, I suppose typically, making up a 16% blend, it depends what feed you've got available, but something along the lines of a third dark grains, a third barley, and a third beet pulp would be around about that composition, along with good energy levels. Or later on, if you were wanting to introduce more barley, if you've got cheap barley or homegrown barley available, it could be 57, 58% barley, a quarter beet pulp, and perhaps 15% soya. And these are just two sort of simple mixtures there, home mixtures that would do the job really equally well, along with some minerals included at the usual sort of rates. Yeah.
I'm going to put my head on the block. I think the trial you're talking about at Harper Adams is one that we've funded or co-funded. So it should be on our website under the R&D section, where we have a sort of a section for finished projects. If the project's been finalised, the report will be there. On the same line,
it was the one that was on James Evans's farm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So along the same lines, in terms of composition, Rhidian, I've had one question about barley. Alongside that, we've had one about use of whole oats in that mixed ration. Whole oats, not crushed or rolled.
Yeah, I think for young calves, you can use whole oats. If you're using barley, then it needs to be bruised, just cracked. But whole oats they've got a bit more sort of fibre and so on, and they should be perfectly okay to use. There's not. You'll probably get some coming through, but it'll be a minimal amount, I'd imagine. Yeah. So whole oats will be fine. Yeah.
A couple of questions about creep feeding heifers. So I'm assuming these are heifer calves as opposed to heifer mothers. Does creep feeding have an impact on fatty udder syndrome when those calves go through as replacement heifers?
No, that's a good question. Right.
Of course, if you don't know the answer, you can always tell us you don't know the answer.
I dare say it might. I'm not really aware of any. I think there's a lot of guys now, especially with your native breeds, they're calving heifers at 2 years old very easily. And I was on a farm yesterday, in fact, where he was having success in bulling heifers, generally at about 370 kilos, but some of them would be a lot lighter than that, 340, 350 kilos. So and seem to be okay. I'm not sure actually on that one in terms of the fatty udders, but I can't imagine it would be a huge problem.
I guess you'd have to weigh it against the benefit of getting that improved growth and getting a heifer at weight to put to the bull.
Yeah. I mean, the targets for bulling at 15 months of age are easily achievable, and especially if you're creep feeding, that they should be quite easy to achieve. And the benefits of that outweigh, in terms of the overall stocking rate, and the groups of animals you've got on the farm will outweigh any small disadvantages. Yeah.
So staying on heifers, is there a danger of heifer calves becoming over fat on creep?
I dare say that if they really gorge themselves, if you get some that might just I'm talking probably native breed heifers, if they really sort of spent the whole day at the trough, they might be just like the rest of us. But I think at that age, you're mainly sort of building frame on them, and you're acclimatizing them to a different diet. So I can't see it being a huge problem.
Okay. A couple of practical questions about the sort of methods for allowing access of calves to creep. You talked about perhaps having a field alongside the grazing, the cows and calves as a sort of almost like a weaning field, a creeping field. Are there any good techniques or simple techniques to allow access for the calves to go through, but the cows not?
Well, obviously the main thing is that there is a barrier that the calves can get through and the cows can't, and I suppose that might be an issue, with native breeds that do their calves really well, where there may not be a huge, you've probably seen these pictures of blue-grey cows with big Charolais calves. I think there's not much difference in size between either of them, so creep feeding might be difficult in that circumstance. But normally, if you wanted to creep them into a next door field to start introducing them to feed in troughs, which would be better to make sure that they're all taking creep, then there might need to be an element of shedding them off to start with, I suppose, just to get them onto it. But otherwise, I suppose, younger animals do tend to be quite inquisitive, and perhaps encouraging them through, by putting a bale of straw or something, they can play football with, or something along those lines. It is always going to be the tricky thing, is making sure that all the calves in a particular group are actually eating it. And I don't know if anybody out there has got tips, then I think we should be collating them, because I'm sure everybody's got their own ideas, really. Because just putting it in a hopper and hoping that they're all going to eat it, you might be lucky and it works, or you might not be, and you find that some calves are eating far more than they should be. But really, I think it is making sure that I think getting them into an adjacent paddock or something to start with might be an idea. I know some farmers that are now looking at creep grazing of calves. It's obviously a far more common thing in sheep, but certainly there was a farmer near us here in Dumfries last year that had his cows on a sort of a 7 or 8 paddock system, where they were in each paddock for 3 or 4 days, and then from about mid-July, I think he did it, he just put some extra tall electric fence posts. You can buy them for horse paddocks and so on, in a couple of places along the fence line, and that allowed the calves to creep under the fence. And in his situation, he was trying to get them to get access to the better grass in the next paddock, while the cows were tidying up the paddock they were on. But you could also do that if you managed to get the calves crept under an electric fence into the next field. You could then start introducing some creep into them to make it even more attractive for them. So that would probably be quite a good way of doing it as well, which wouldn't need shedding off and trying to encourage them through a creep gate that they're not familiar with and so on. Just making use of their inquisitiveness to creep under a fence.
So that's an Ask the Audience question there. Answers on a postcard. Any good ideas for allowing calves access either to forward grazing or to a creep feed area? We'd welcome those. Email in your questions. So just to remind you all, you can email your questions in. We've had a few in to brpconf, C-O-N-F, at ahdb.org.uk, or you can text your questions to 07973 701 211. Just to remind you that to back up what Rhidian's telling you, there's various publications on the EBLEX website, the AHDB Beef and Lamb website, under the Better Returns Programme page, beef manuals 5 and 7 cover finishing growing animals and feeding cows as well. And we've got various grazing manuals there. And the grass MOT, which I think will come up in this next section, really, and looking at the value of grass. So shall we move on? I think let me just check we've covered everyone's questions. Oh, sorry, there was one question. We've been talking about spring-born calves. Are there any different rules for creep feeding autumn-born calves? I guess the timing would be the main issue there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a completely different system, isn't it, really? And with, it gives you options at weaning, at turnout, I suppose, in that you can either wean the calves and treat them as a separate group, or they can be turned out on their mothers. So it would largely depend on exactly when in the autumn, whether it was late summer or sort of early winter that they were born. I think that a lot of people will set up a creep pen in the shed for autumn-born calves, which means that apart from anything else, apart from the possibility of introducing them to another feed, which would be just the same as a normal creep system, you're actually giving them a safe refuge away from the cows, away from big 600 kilo brutes or more that could stand on them and hurt them, and it gives you an opportunity to keep that creep area really well bedded, so that it's a much more hygienic environment for them. They can go in there and lie in a nice, clean, safe environment, and then you can start introducing them to feeds as well. And in terms of what you might feed them, again, that trial I mentioned was on autumn-born calves, and that suggested that you got a return from having a 16% protein feed, which I suppose you would recommend anyway. But I suppose the only other difference with autumn-born is that in spring-born cows and calves will be out at grass, and that could vary in quality from as well. But if they're inside in a shed getting fed, then you would probably need to take the forage quality into account, which you would do anyway, but in terms of the cow's own nutrition, because if the calf's eating, getting milk, silage and creep, then the quality of the silage comes into it as well. So you need to take into account the quality of the forage, I suppose, in deciding what the creep feed was. Yeah.
We've had a question. We've been talking about creep feeding from 4 months, Rhidian. A question that sort of just asks, is there any value in trying to encourage calves onto creep from an earlier age, 3 months perhaps?
Well, I mean, I suppose if you think of a dairy calf, the aim there is to try and wean it as early as possible, because you're feeding it milk, which is very expensive, and trying to get it weaned and onto a hard feeding or a forage as soon as you can. So dairy-born calves will be weaned at 6 to 8 weeks of age, possibly, or slightly older than that. I suppose with the suckler calves, there's not so much urgency. The cow has to do some work, hasn't she? She has to earn her keep, really. And I suppose if you had a system where you were leaving all your bull calves entire and finishing them on an intensive diet post-weaning, then you could introduce the creep a bit earlier. But I don't, you're not going to do it from birth. You're probably not, you need to get some benefit from the cow producing milk off grass from upland pastures, which nothing else can utilize as efficiently as a suckler cow. So you've got to look at the economics of the whole thing. I suppose it's if you can get your cows to produce cheap milk, those calves are going to do really well on milk. We're talking about feed conversion rate. The best you're going to get is on the milk rather than buying an expensive feed. It's more of a management tool for later on in lactation. Yeah.
And one final one, really, might not be your topic area. It might be one for the next conference call in September. Is it worth worming spring-born calves? So this is somebody whose calves were born between last March and May. should spring-born calves be wormed, and if so, when?
So is that when they're on their mothers or the year after?
I think this is. I'm going to take a guess here. I'm assuming that these are coming around to being a year-old calves, so they're not so much. It's less a creep feeding question and more about.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in a way, you're right. It's not my subject, but
okay. We'll come back to that one.
I'll answer it because I think that the important thing is that yes, the thing to do obviously is to, in conjunction with your veterinary advisor, and I think if they're year-olds and they're going out to grass, then yes, they will need a worming treatment of some sort. But obviously there's a whole range of different treatments they could be getting, whether it was monitoring egg counts and worming as and when they need to be wormed, or whether it was just giving them a long-acting wormer for ease of management. There's a whole range of different. But I think that, at some point they will need worming, but really to discuss it with your vet. Okay,
I think that's a good range of questions. Thank you, everyone. Keep them coming in if you've got questions for Rhidian. We'll move on, I think, Rhidian, to our second topic, looking more generally at supplementation of cattle at grass.
Okay, right. Thanks, Chris. I don't get a break. Yeah, okay. Right. Again, I've tried to split this into sort of two areas. And first of all, I suppose the obvious question is, do we need to supplement cattle at grass? And if we do, the second bit then is, well, how much do we give them, and what do you give them, and so on. So the first part, I think, is do we need to feed cattle at grass? And I, as many of you might know, I'm quite an advocate of improving grassland production, grassland management, and grazed grass is by far and away the cheapest and potentially one of the highest quality feeds that you can grow on your farm, or you can feed to your animals, especially so in spring and early summer when it's both there in terms of quantity and quality. So really, in terms of feeding animals concentrates at grass, it's a case of you only need to feed them if you're going to benefit from that, so that you're not replacing high quality grass, but supplementing it. So you're going to get extra performance. So I think it depends on the quality and quantity of the grass that you've got. So again, we see more and more people now moving towards rotational grazing systems, or even just really well managed set stock systems. And I think if you're doing either of those well, then your grass quality will be high, and the response to feeding concentrates will be less the higher the quality of the grass is. So if you have downloaded the fact sheet, or we'll look at it later on, there is a table in there which you've probably all seen before. It's the grazing guidelines for cattle, both in terms of rotational systems and set stock systems. And so, for example, for growing animals at grass, typically you'd be in a rotational system, you would be going in at about 10 to 15 centimeters and coming out at 5 to 6 centimeters. I think if you're grazing to those parameters, you can't really avoid but have high quality grass, because you are really grazing it when it's at a very young digestible leafy stage, and it will be high quality. It will be 11.5 to 12 ME and a high protein content as well. And in a well-managed set stock system, where you're maintaining the sward at about 6 to 8 centimeters, again, because you are managing those swards at that sort of at that height, then it will be high quality and you will get good performance from it. Where you've got to be very careful in terms of a set stock system is that if it's just a rigid system where you put X number of animals out and leave them to it, then you'll either have too much grass, in which case in early summer they'll perform very well, but then as the grass goes to head and stemmy, then the quality will decline, and you'll end up with getting good performance in the early part of the season, but it will drop away rapidly in late summer and into the autumn. And then the other extreme, I suppose, is if there's not enough grass and they've put too much stock on the field, and they'll just be short of grass, all through the summer, and you'll get poor performance. So I think set stocking to me is never really set stocking. It's about being flexible with it as well, without perhaps going to a full rotational system. So grass is probably going to give you the cheapest feed that you've got, so supplementing really only needs to enhance it and not replace it. And I suppose, how do you know if you've got good grass, as well as obviously grazing management in terms of managing it between certain parameters? I think it's a case of looking at what you've got, assessing the ryegrass content. That ryegrass will have nice shiny dark green leaves that will have a red base to the shoot and so on. It's easy to see what you've got once it's gone to seed, because all the different species of grass have different seed designs. But it's not so easy when it's just green leaf. But the weed grasses will probably head at a much earlier stage than your ryegrasses. So it's a case of assessing what you've got, and if you grab a handful of grass and it's mostly leaf, there's not much stem and seed heads in there, and there's some nice dark green leaves in there that are likely to be ryegrass, then yes, you can say that that's going to be quite high quality. So I thought, Chris, that we would perhaps see if there's any questions about the grass side of things first before we move on to the concentrates.
Yes, just while we've paused there, just to signpost people to the eBlex website. So if, like me, you struggle with your grass identification and didn't pay attention at college, there is a very useful grassland guide on the eBlex website under the feed and forage side there, under the feed and forage section of the BRP pages, called the eBlex Grassland Guide, and there's a useful sort of diagrammatical page there showing the different sort of leaf structures of the different varieties. I guess my question, Rhidian, is, I hear what you're saying. It's about understanding the quality of your grass, but is there a sort of a really handy tip in terms of we've all got what we've got, but how do we know whether we've got good grass or poor grass? Is there a general guide that you would give us?
Well, it's always possible to actually cut a sample and get it analysed, but grass grows quite rapidly at this time of year, and especially this week when it's been wet and warm, which is perfect for grass growth. And so if you analyse a field today and you wait till next week to get the results back, that grass might have gone way over by the time you get the results back. So you can do that. You can get it sampled, and some people do, and usually as part of various projects that are looking at that sort of thing. But I suppose, like I said before, it's really just a case of, having a look, get down on your knees and actually have a look at the grass and look at what the stock are eating. And if there's not too much seed heads and stems there, then they are going to be eating green leaf, and that's going to be 12 ME or more, and it's going to be 20% protein or more, and they will perform on that. And I think, I know we keep going on about rotational grazing, but if you do rotational grazing and you are grazing grass between 10, 15 centimetres when you go in and 5 or 6 centimetres when you come out, you almost can't avoid having high quality grass, because that's what you get in those sort of horizons, if you like. It's going to be high quality leafy digestible grass. Okay,
again, a plug for the AHDB Beef and Lamb publications. Great. On that BRP page, you'll find a publication called Grazing Strategies, which is generic manual number 8. That's got more information on those different grazing strategies that Rhidian's covered. Rhidian, I think we're up to date with questions at the moment. So do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'll carry on. Yeah. Right. So really, while I've told you so far that you should be managing your grass better, so you don't need concentrates. Obviously, that's not always the case, and there still might be instances when you do need to supplement your grass. Depending on what the fate of the animals are, if you're wanting to, again, just like we said earlier with creep feeding, you might want to transition them onto a different feed, when they come inside, or you just want to get them growing rapidly to meet your sale targets, either stored or finished before they need to be housed again, when all the costs suddenly rack up. So really, it's a case of what you're going to do with the animals next, and if you've got good quality grass, you might not need to supplement them at all, or you might only need to supplement them with a small amount of concentrates to enhance the grass that you've got. But if your grass quality isn't so good in late summer and early autumn, or both in terms of quality and quantity, I suppose, then obviously you need to then supplement them with more concentrates. And again, I suppose it's similar to creep feeding. It's getting them onto it. Feed them little and often in troughs to start with, and then certainly build it up to whatever level you need to feed them to. So if we stick with finishing cattle to start with, if you're looking for cattle to grow at over 1 kilo a day at grass, then there's a good chance that they will need supplementation, certainly from sort of midsummer onwards. Again, it depends on the system, the breeds and so on. Some native bred animals perhaps don't need quite so much because they're earlier maturing and they'll do better on a forage system. But as you get more continental, then they will respond more, and feeding at grass it gives you financial rewards. And again, what do you feed them with? Well, again, it's really, you're looking at grass. Grass has got an excess of protein, so really what you feed them should balance that. And so typically feeding them cereals such as bruised barley. It's got high energy and starch content, so really that would complement the grass very well. If you've got really poor grass for finishing cattle, then you may even go as far as putting an ad lib hopper once they're built up to it. But I mean, I must admit myself that I would say, well, if you're doing that, then they'd almost be as well being housed and fed indoors, and then that field can be released for something else. Whether it's sheep or another group of cattle, because again, if you're feeding ad lib. So if you're feeding cattle ad lib at grass, then there's a danger they might sort of just concentrate on eating hopper, or eating concentrates out the hopper, and not be bothered about eating grass at all, and they might as well be in a shed as far as I'm concerned. So there was some Irish research done a few years back which suggested that if the grass is plentiful, in terms of quality and reasonable quantity, then feeding about 0.5 kilo per 100 kilos of live weight was beneficial. But if the grass if the supply was poor or moderate, in terms of quality and quantity, then you can double that to 1 kilogram per day per 100 kilograms of body weight. And I would suggest that if you've got 400 or 500 kilo cattle and you're feeding them 1 kilo per 100, 4 or 5 kilos a day, then again, you really need to perhaps think about either putting them on a sacrifice area or just housing them to do it, because essentially they're on a house diet, but still outside. If you're feeding store cattle at grass, then again, a lot depends on what you're intending to do with them. If you want to house them for finishing, then yes, then again it's a transitional thing in terms of getting them used to a different diet. And I suppose the same would apply if you're selling them as forward stores in the autumn. It's beneficial to somebody else that they're already on some sort of hard feeding. And again, good grassland again should give you at least 0.8 kilos a day on a store beast a day. And I know of farmers who are achieving over 1 kilo a day with really good grassland management. So in those circumstances, then feeding concentrates perhaps is not required. But again, it does depend on the fate of the animals and what they're going to be doing next. And I suppose it is a similar thing to creep-fed animals. Your benefits are going to be more in terms of response to concentrates in late summer and autumn when the grass quality is declining, and again you're going to get the benefit of the transition onto a different diet. And I suppose this is the sort of thing that everybody will have their own ideas on it, and at the end of the day, there's no hard and fast rules about these things. There's just a few guidelines, and there's a huge range of grass types, grassland pasture quality, quantity, yields of grass and so on. People have got different breeds of cattle, whether it's native bred or continental bred, and they'll have a range of different systems that they're selling the stock at different ages. So, I suppose it's finding out what works on your farm, actually doing the calculation to see if you are getting a benefit, because at the end of the day, really supplementing cattle with expensive concentrates to replace cheap grass, it has to be beneficial. Otherwise, you're just replacing the cheaper feed with a more expensive feed. A farm that I work with quite a lot over the years, they do rotational grazing of stabilizer bullocks at from a year old to about 16, 17 months of age, and they do rotational grazing. It's a very simple system. All they're doing is moving them on every 4 or 5 days onto a fresh bit of grass. And the pasture quality on that farm, we've measured it, in October, it's still 11 ME. So, if you've got good grassland management through the summer, keep on top of it at this time of year, then it will maintain that quality all the way through. And feeding concentrates will not be as it won't be as necessary as if you've got poorer quality grass. Okay.
That's a good point to stop. So just to remind everybody, if you've got a question for Rhidian, email it to brpconf@ahsdb.org.uk or text me on 07973 701 211. You've still got a few minutes to get your questions in before we end the call. Most of the questions, Rhidian, seem to be about pasture quality, really, and I suppose the very clear message you've given to us all is that grazing management to maintain leaf rather than allow it to go to stem is the key. Rotational grazing seems to have lots of benefits in terms of trying to do that. And if we haven't done that this year, and I'm sure we're all going to go and do it next year, it might already be too late for that pasture. So the questions relate to topping and level of stem and so on. So if things have gone past the cattle already and we've got stems in the pasture, is the advice to top that and wait for it to regenerate? That's part one of the questions. And the second thing is, presumably we're okay to supplement while the grass is waiting to coming back through.
Topping should really be a tool to prevent heading, not tidy up after it's happened. But I accept that's normally what does happen. And again, topping with a mower, or not necessarily a mower as such, but a really sharp topper that leaves a clean cut is going to give you good regrowth. So I suppose it depends on how low you're going to top. I think that in a rotational system, you've probably got another field they could be in, and the topping will hopefully encourage regrowth. Good leafy regrowth. So I don't see that in itself means that you need to feed concentrates. Another way of doing it, which I've got some experience of, is that if the field is slightly getting away from the cattle, but there's not enough to justify shutting it up and baling it for silage, for example, is you actually mow the grass a day or two ahead of the cattle, and then wilt it for a day or two, and then let the cattle eat it. And in a way, what you're doing there is you're actually making them eat the wilted grass, which they do really like. It's nice stuff for them to eat. So you're actually utilising all that grass that would otherwise have been topped, but you're topping the field at the same time. So you're doing two jobs at once, and you're getting the benefit of that grass. And I think that's probably a preferable thing to topping after they've been in the field. Is to pre-mow it, and certainly it's a very common thing on a lot of dairy farms. I know a lot of the Irish beef farmers do it as well, and I said that I know more and more farmers over here now that are doing it as well, just as a management tool. At this sort of time of year when this grass might be starting to get away, if you haven't got your stocking rates quite right, but there's not quite enough to justify making silage out of it.
And is that weather dependent, Rhidian? I mean, if you've got a wet few days coming up, would you still do that?
Well, see, again, I suppose it is, because if you're just mowing it a day ahead of them, it's not such an issue. And I suppose if it's wet, then you really don't want the grass to start rotting before they can eat it. So I think 2 days, you wouldn't do more than 2 days ahead of them. And preferably it would be a day. So I appreciate that there's a time element and cost element to doing that. But if you're going to be spending the time and the diesel on topping anyway, then there's no real difference, is there, to cutting it before they graze it, or cutting it or topping it after they've grazed it. But yes, I think in an ideal world you'd cut them a day's worth of grass at a time. I mean, one farm very close to here that I do a lot of work with is what they once they've done their silage, the mower's left on the tractor, and for a couple of weeks they can just go in and top the odd paddock if it needs to before the calf are grazing. And certainly this last week or so, they've topped about 3 paddocks, I think, ahead of the cattle, just because it was slightly getting away from the stock, and to sort of tidy it up before the next rotation.
So it sort of it resets the grass, I suppose, is what you're saying. Rather than leaving the animals to graze it, it's resetting it so that then starts with a fresh leaf.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And again, you don't top it, you don't mow it probably quite as low as you would mow if you were cutting for silage. When you're leaving it really white and yellow, aren't you, in the base? You want to still leave a bit of green there. So you're probably mowing it at 5-6 centimeters or whatever it is. So that the regrowth will be fairly rapid, but you're still tidying it up at the same time. Yeah.
This is a comment relevant for those of us in the part of the country where it's quite dry and we're waiting for some rain. Things are already beginning to dry up. But having been to France to meet their meat industry organisation, the middle of France is completely bone dry at the moment. But and they've got no regrowth for the plan for the next couple of months. They tend to supplement with forage, silage, or hay of some kind, Rhidian. Is that, I suppose, it's really down to the value or the quality of that forage as a supplementation at grass?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, there's no reason why you can't supplement with forage. I suppose the thing is, though, is that there's two things I will say, is that your silage, when you make silage, you tend to make, the silage isn't quite as high quality as the grass was. So grass will be very high quality. So if you're replacing it with silage that's not quite as good quality as the grass would have been, then it might pay to supplement them with a bit of concentrate as well, just to make up that difference. And so the other thing then is that, and this is what a lot of the Irish are doing, is if they've, in a paddock system or a rotational system, if you've got a paddock that's getting away from the stock and it's too much to pre-mow and graze, like I said before, is yes, they will bale it, but they will leave those bales stacked in the field, and then they'll use those bales, at some point in the summer when the grass declines, whether it's because of the natural growing season or the fact that it's a dry period. You can feed the silage back to the stock to save you from having to take them elsewhere, I suppose. And certainly there's a few people getting around to that way of thinking as well. So it's all about thinking about the system and how you can make it as efficient as possible. But yes, I mean, I suppose back to your original question. Yes, if you were supplementing with forage, it's still better than bringing them inside, where suddenly you've got a whole load of other costs, I suppose. And I suppose in this country we're quite lucky that, apart from the odd year, we don't have huge droughts generally, and certainly recently, we've had no shortage of rainfall. So it's not such a huge problem in this part of the country. Although, I appreciate there might be parts of eastern England that do have much drier conditions than we do in the rest of the country. Yeah.
You need to come down and visit us, Rhidian. Well, I'll show you some dry fields at the moment. So just moving on, last couple of questions. And I'm going to combine a couple of them. It's looking at sort of trace elements and mineral supplementation. One question, is it okay to use wheat feed and barley alone, or would that need supplementation? And then there's a subsequent question to that. If we've talked about energy and ME at grass, are there any needs to worry or think about mineral supplements while at grazing? So 2 questions. If you're supplementary feeding wheat feed and barley alone, or would that need mineral supplementation first?
Yeah. I think, it's not my specialist area, I must admit, but yeah, I think if you're feeding large amounts of a concentrate like that, then they would need to be adequately mineralized, with a general purpose mineral. So what was the second bit?
Well, the second one is if we're at grass, we talked about the energy and ME requirement of the grass. What about trace elements?
Yeah, again, I think most farmers will be well aware of what their status is in terms of the major things, your cobalt, selenium, iodine, copper, and so on. So most farmers will know, or their vet will know of what's the problems in the locality and so on. And we'll be able to treat the animals with a supplement or a bolus or whatever, and that generally tends to take care of that. I think if you're just grazing animals, a lot of people do put out tubs or buckets of free access minerals. I must admit I prefer to treat the animals for what the problems are in your particular area. There's lots of very good boluses available these days. But yes, if you're supplementing with concentrates and that, then obviously a bigger chunk of the diet is going to come from the bag as opposed to growing out the ground, where it's drawing up all the minerals and so on. So it will need to be supplemented appropriately. Yeah.
Good. Rhidian, we've put you through the mill for about an hour now. I think it's time to let you off the hook. So just a couple of final comments from me. Anyone who hasn't tried it yet, we launched a herd calendar a couple of weeks ago, which is a useful tool. You put your calving or your bulling date in, and it's preset with a number of tasks which we feel are important that every farmer should do, or you can put your own tasks in there, or you could even record some of the information we've been talking about today in terms of field performance and so on. That's at www.herdcalendar.com, and I do urge you, if you've certainly got suckler cows, to go on there and put your bulling date in, and it'll preset and send you an email the Sunday before that task is required, so you can forget about it and we'll remind you when that task is ready.